Hello everyone. Alexander Vasilievich Suvorov is remembered by posterity as one of the brightest symbols of Russian military art and one of the greatest commanders in world history. He was not only an undefeated general on the battlefield, but also the embodiment of strategic intelligence, courage, and an iron sense of discipline combined with deep human understanding. To historians, Suvorov represented a rare harmony between reason and instinct, between the sternness of a soldier and the compassion of a father, between the strength of discipline and the flexibility of tactical thought. These qualities elevated him beyond the realm of a mere general, turning him into a cultural phenomenon, a military legend whose brilliance time could not dim. Suvorov's legacy is not measured only by his string of victories, but also by the profound philosophy he left behind. To him, war was not merely a clash of armies, but a test of will and intellect. His famous saying, "Victory depends not on numbers but on skill," became the guiding principle of Russian military thought for generations. In an age when European armies were bound by rigid ceremony, Suvorov championed agility, daring, and practicality. He believed in the power of speed, surprise, and above all, the fighting spirit of soldiers, a spirit nourished by faith and loyalty. His doctrine of fighting with the heart created a unique command style, one that inspired his troops not only to obey him, but to trust and love him as a father. Through centuries, from Imperial Russia to the Soviet era and into modern times, Suvorov's name has remained synonymous with leadership, discipline, and creative military genius. His principles are still studied in military academies, his victories analyzed by strategists across the world. Many Western historians have compared him to Hannibal, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon. And some even argue that, in terms of versatility and adaptability, Suvorov surpassed them all. For the Russian people, Suvorov is not just a national hero, but the embodiment of the Russian spirit, resilient, fearless, and steadfast in the face of hardship. His image is tied not only to the thunder of victory, but also to the enduring human desire to transcend limitations. Through time, he stands as living proof that when talent and virtue unite, they create a power that endures across centuries. Born in 1729 in Moscow to an old noble family with a proud military tradition, Alexander Suvorov inherited both discipline and devotion from his father, General Vasily Suvorov, a prominent figure under Peter the Great. From a young age, Alexander displayed an unusual passion for warfare, studying the classics of strategy by Caesar, Tacitus, and the great European generals. Frail in body but unbreakable in will, he trained himself relentlessly to grow strong and resilient, traits that later defined his austere, enduring style of command. As a child, Alexander was often mocked for his fragile frame. The other boys could run faster, wrestle harder, and laugh louder, but none possessed the same quiet fire that burned within him. When illness confined him indoors, he turned his weakness into a weapon. He read, analyzed, and imagined battles fought centuries before his birth. While others played, he studied the art of war, mapping imaginary campaigns across the worn wooden floor of his family's home. He would rise before dawn, plunging himself into icy water to toughen his body, running through the fields with stones tied to his legs to build endurance. His father, though stern, recognized something extraordinary in the boy, not strength of body, but of spirit. "You are not yet a soldier." Vasily told him once, "but you already understand what it means to fight." At night, young Suvorov would whisper to himself the lessons he learned from the ancients. Know yourself, and you will know victory. He believed that before mastering the enemy, a warrior must first conquer his own fear, laziness, and doubt. Each bruise, each moment of exhaustion became a silent vow that one day he would prove that willpower could overcome any weakness. By the time he reached adolescence, the frail boy had vanished. In his place stood a lean, alert young man whose eyes burned with purpose. Those who once pitied him now stood in awe. Suvorov had forged himself in the fire of self-discipline, and though few yet knew his name, destiny was already watching. At 17, Suvorov entered the army, starting from the lowest rank. He quickly distinguished himself through both tactical brilliance and his profound understanding of human nature. He lived simply, sharing hardships with his men, earning their respect not by rank, but by example. To Suvorov, soldiers were not tools of war, but the very soul of the army, a deeply humanistic view rare among the generals of his age. Throughout his service, he never stopped learning. He saw education as a lifelong duty and rejected blind conformity in favor of adaptability and reason. His open mind and creative spirit set him apart, a scholar of war who could both think and act decisively. As his fame grew, Suvorov became more than a soldier. He was a teacher, a reformer, and a visionary whose ideas reshaped the Russian army. Even today, his principles of leadership, discipline, and humanity are revered. In military thought, his life stands as a testament to unwavering loyalty, tireless self-discipline, and practical genius, a man whose faith in duty and honor lifted him beyond the limits of his age. When the drums of war thundered across Europe, the young Alexander Suvorov was barely more than a boy in uniform. The Russian Empire had entered the conflict against Sweden, and soon after, the long and grueling wars with Prussia followed. To most, these were struggles between kings and empires, but to Suvorov, it was a crucible where a soldier's soul was forged. His first true test came in 1759 at the bloody Battle of Kunersdorf. The fields were shrouded in smoke, the cries of men mingling with the thunder of cannon. Suvorov, then a young officer, witnessed chaos unlike anything he had imagined from his books. The air reeked of powder and despair, yet amid the carnage he did not falter. When others hesitated, he rallied a shattered line, shouting, "Forward! Victory favors the bold!" The Russians and Austrians won that day, a triumph written in fire and blood. But for Suvorov, it was no celebration. Standing among the wounded, he understood that real glory was not in the roar of victory, but in the endurance of those who fought and fell. From that moment, he vowed to lead differently, not as a master of men, but as their guardian. In 1760, he marched with the Russian army into Berlin, his name whispered with admiration among comrades. The frail boy who once dreamed of battles now strode through the enemy's capital as a man hardened by war. By 1761, he was recognized not only for his courage, but for his intellect, and behind the stern eyes of the soldier glimmered the fire of a thinker. That same year, in St. Petersburg, he joined the Masonic Lodge des Trois Étoiles, seeking wisdom beyond the battlefield. When the wars finally ended in 1763, Suvorov emerged not just as a survivor, but as a man transformed. He had faced the cruelty of war and yet preserved his humanity. What others saw as an end, he saw as a beginning, the first chapter in a lifelong struggle to unite strength with compassion, strategy with soul. When the drums of war thundered across Europe, the young Alexander Suvorov was barely more than a boy in uniform. The Russian Empire had entered the conflict against Sweden, and soon after, the long and grueling wars with Prussia followed. To most, these were struggles between kings and empires, but to Suvorov, it was a crucible where a soldier's soul was forged. His first true test came in 1759 at the bloody Battle of Kunersdorf. The fields were shrouded in smoke, the cries of men mingling with the thunder of cannon. Suvorov, then a young officer, witnessed chaos unlike anything he had imagined from his books. The air reeked of powder and despair. Yet amid the carnage, he did not falter. When others hesitated, he rallied a shattered line, shouting, "Forward! Victory favors the bold!" The Russians and Austrians won that day, a triumph written in fire and blood. But for Suvorov, it was no celebration. Standing among the wounded, he understood that real glory was not in the roar of victory, but in the endurance of those who fought and fell. From that moment he vowed to lead differently, not as a master of men, but as their guardian. In 1760, he marched with the Russian army into Berlin, his name whispered with admiration among comrades. The frail boy who once dreamed of battles now strode through the enemy's capital as a man hardened by war. By 1761, he was recognized not only for his courage, but for his intellect, and behind the stern eyes of the soldier glimmered the fire of a thinker. That same year, in St. Petersburg, he joined the Masonic Lodge des Trois Étoiles, seeking wisdom beyond the battlefield. When the wars finally ended in 1763, Suvorov emerged not just as a survivor, but as a man transformed. He had faced the cruelty of war and yet preserved his humanity. What others saw as an end, he saw as a beginning, the first chapter in a lifelong struggle to unite strength with compassion, strategy with soul. In the spring of 1762, after years of marching, learning, and enduring, Alexander Suvorov received his first real command. The war was over, but the army never truly slept. He was appointed colonel and given charge of the famed Astrakhan Regiment, a formation with a proud past and a restless present. The men were seasoned, but their spirit had dulled under the weight of endless drills and rigid discipline. Suvorov saw it at once. Soldiers moved like machines, precise but soulless. He began his command not with punishment but with presence. He walked among the ranks, spoke with the men, remembered names, and ate their rations beside the campfire. "A commander," he said quietly one night, "must be the first to rise and the last to rest." Soon the regiment started to change. Orders were carried out faster, not from fear, but from faith. Suvorov's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp, and behind them burned the same resolve that had carried him through Kunersdorf. By the end of that year, he was reassigned to lead the Suzdal Regiment, another storied unit, and one that would become his forge of ideas. It was here that Suvorov wrote what would later be known as the Instructions for the Suzdal Regiment, a brief, handwritten text passed from officer to officer, more a confession than a manual. In it, he condemned the stiff Prussian methods that reduced men to puppets, and instead urged commanders to teach with the heart, not the stick. He believed that discipline without understanding bred cowardice, and that a soldier's courage came from trust in his commander, not terror of him. In 1768, illness forced him from duty for nearly a year. The army marched on without him, but the silence of recovery brought reflection. He reread the ancient strategists, Xenophon, Caesar, Maurice de Saxe, and took notes in the margins, arguing with ghosts of generals long dead. When his strength returned, it did so with clarity. He rejoined his regiment leaner, older, and sharper than before, with a vision that was wholly his own. That same year, rebellion flared in the lands of Poland. The Bar Confederation had risen against Russian influence, and Catherine's empire needed steady hands to restore order. Suvorov was sent with a small brigade, no more than a few thousand men, into a land where every town could turn into a fortress overnight. He moved swiftly, using terrain, deception, and speed to shatter larger forces before they could unite. At Landskron, he struck like lightning. At Krakow, he encircled the enemy with half their number, his soldiers moving so quickly that the Poles later said they were fighting ghosts. When the dust settled, Suvorov's name began to travel beyond the camps. Soldiers told stories of the colonel who rode at the front, who shared their bread and their danger, who punished cruelty more than cowardice. In March 1770, the Empress promoted him to Major General. The news reached him on the march. He read the order under the grey morning sky, nodded once, and quietly folded the paper. Around him, the men cheered. Suvorov simply said, "The army marches on." The war with the Ottoman Empire began in the south, where the wide plains of the Danube met the dark forests of Bulgaria. The Russian army marched under blazing suns and endless dust, their boots sinking into the black soil of a foreign land. Among the officers sent to the front was Major General Alexander Suvorov, a man few outside the army yet knew, but whose reputation within the ranks was already whispered with awe. He arrived in the spring of 1773, joining the forces of Field Marshal Pyotr Rumyantsev. The campaign was bogged down in cautious maneuvers. The Ottomans held the river crossings with strong fortresses, and the Russian troops, exhausted by marches and disease, hesitated to advance. Suvorov watched, restless. He studied the maps, the flow of the river, the rhythm of enemy patrols. Every night he rode out quietly to the front lines, his cloak soaked with dew, his eyes searching for weakness. At dawn on June 10th, he found it. The fortress of Turtukai lay on the riverbank, a stone citadel defended by thousands, but its garrison had grown careless, believing the Russians too far to strike. Suvorov saw opportunity where others saw risk. "We attack before sunrise," he said, his tone calm but final. His officers hesitated. Their force numbered barely 2,000 men. The Ottomans had 6 times as many. Suvorov's answer was simple. "Speed will make us equal." That night the men marched silently through reeds and mist. No drums, no trumpets, only the sound of boots on wet ground. As the first light broke, Suvorov stood before them, saber drawn. "Brothers," he said, "not one step back until the flag flies over their walls." Then he charged. The assault on Turtukai was chaos turned to choreography. Russian grenadiers scaled the ramparts under a rain of bullets. Suvorov himself led the vanguard, shouting orders that cut through the din like steel. When the smoke cleared, the fortress was theirs. Over 2,000 Ottomans lay defeated. The rest fled across the river in panic. The Russians, bloodied but unbroken, cheered their commander's name for the first time. News of the victory spread through the army like wildfire. Officers who had doubted him now spoke his name with respect. Field Marshal Rumyantsev himself embraced Suvorov on the field, awarding him the Order of St. George. But Suvorov said little. His eyes turned south, toward the horizon where the Empire's next challenge waited. A year later, in June 1774, he faced it, the Battle of Kozludja. The odds were worse than before. 15,000 Russians against 70,000 Ottomans under the Grand Vizier Abdul Rezak Pasha. The sun hung heavy over the valley, the air trembling with heat. Suvorov rode the lines, his uniform dusted with powder, his voice steady as he spoke to the men. "They are many. We are few. That is not new." He deployed his troops in 3 tight columns, using the rolling hills to hide his movement. Then, with perfect timing, he struck, not at the center, but at the heart of confusion. His cavalry feigned retreat, drawing the Ottoman horsemen into a trap of crossfire. When the enemy's formation broke, Suvorov unleashed his infantry with bayonets fixed. The Russians advanced in silence, their lines unbroken even as cannonballs tore through them. The field became a storm of dust, smoke, and steel. By evening, the Ottoman army disintegrated. Thousands fled, others threw down their weapons. Suvorov, his horse wounded, rode among the ranks, shouting for mercy toward the captives. The enemy banners were lowered, one after another, until only the Russian flag remained. The Battle of Kozludja shattered Ottoman morale and forced the Empire to sue for peace. But for Suvorov, it was not triumph he remembered, only the faces of his men, blackened by smoke, their uniforms torn, their eyes shining with exhaustion and pride. He dismounted, walked among them, and said quietly, "You have done what history will not forget." The Empire was finally at peace, or so it seemed. The war with the Ottomans had ended, and Russia's borders stretched further than ever before. But deep in the Volga plains, a different fire was spreading, not from foreign cannons, but from within. A Cossack named Emelian Pugachev had declared himself to be the murdered Tsar Peter III, calling peasants and soldiers to rise against Catherine's rule. Villages burned, garrisons were slaughtered. The empire trembled. Suvorov, now a general known for victories abroad, was ordered north to deal with the uprising. He accepted the summons without ceremony. There was no glory in this kind of war. His eyes, once sharpened by the thrill of battle, were now heavy with something colder, duty. He traveled through the charred countryside, where smoke still rose from ruined towns. The peasants fled at the sight of uniforms, not knowing whether the soldiers before them came as protectors or punishers. Suvorov rode in silence. His men saw him stop often, to help a wounded villager, to order food given to starving families. He said little, but his presence was enough. Where he passed, the burning slowed, and the fear began to wane. When he reached the frontier of the rebellion, the fighting was already dying. Pugachev's forces had splintered, betrayed from within. Suvorov met the self-proclaimed Tsar not on the battlefield, but in a tent under guard. The Cossack leader was haggard, his beard unkempt, his clothes torn. He raised his eyes and asked quietly, "You are Suvorov?" The general nodded. "Then you have come to kill me." Suvorov's answer was calm. "No, others have already done that." He questioned Pugachev briefly about his men, his reasons, his lies. Then he turned away. The rebellion had burned itself out. Within days, Pugachev was handed over to Moscow, and the axe finished what war could not. Suvorov did not attend the execution. He had no need to see it. Afterward, he remained in the provinces for several weeks, restoring order. There were no parades, no medals. He slept in tents beside his soldiers, helped rebuild bridges and granaries, and punished looting as severely as mutiny. His dispatches to the capital were short. The uprising is over. The people are calm. Nothing more. When he finally returned to St. Petersburg, winter had already settled. The streets were quiet, the air sharp with frost. He entered the city alone, without escort, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Above him, the sky was clear, cold, endless, and still. Autumn, 1794. The city of Warsaw burned on the horizon, red, grey, and screaming. Poland had risen in rebellion under Tadeusz Kościuszko, fighting desperately against the weight of empires. By November, the rebellion's last hope rested in Praga, the eastern suburb of the capital, fortified with earthworks, cannon, and the courage of men who refused to bow. Into this storm marched Alexander Suvorov, commander of the Russian army, already a legend, feared for his speed, discipline, and the cold precision of his victories. But this time, his orders were not glorious. They were final. Crush the uprising, the Tsar had said. Leave no sword unsheathed. At dawn on November 4th, the Russian artillery opened fire. The sky shook. Suvorov stood behind the batteries, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the smoke rising over Praga. He had planned the assault to the minute, 3 columns advancing simultaneously, no pause, no mercy. By mid-morning, Russian grenadiers breached the ramparts. The Polish defenders fought with the fury of the condemned. Boys, craftsmen, priests wielding muskets and scythes. For every Russian who fell, 2 Poles rose in his place. The narrow streets turned into rivers of fire and blood. But Suvorov's discipline, that cold, relentless machine, moved forward. The Polish lines broke. Panic spread. Then came the moment no strategy could control. The soldiers, mad with exhaustion and revenge for fallen comrades, descended upon the civilians. Houses were set ablaze, the air filled with screams. Women, children, old men, all caught in the storm, unleashed by men who had seen too much war. Suvorov tried to send orders to stop the slaughter, but chaos had no chain of command. His aides could not be heard over the roar. For hours the massacre raged. When the sun set, Praga was gone. 10,000 souls silenced beneath the smoke. That night Suvorov walked alone through the ruins. The ground was still hot beneath his boots. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. He stopped beside a collapsed chapel, its crucifix half buried in ash. One of his officers approached, trembling. "Your Excellency, we have taken Warsaw." Suvorov did not look up. "No," he said softly. "We have destroyed it." In his official report, he wrote only 13 words. The enemy defeated, Praga taken, troops performed their duty. But to those who saw him that night, the victory looked like a wound that would never heal. When the news reached St. Petersburg, Catherine the Great rewarded him with the rank of Field Marshal, the highest honor in the empire. At the ceremony, courtiers applauded. Suvorov bowed, face pale, eyes far away. He was victorious, but something in him had died at Praga. In later years, when young officers praised his triumphs, he would turn aside and murmur, "There are battles the soul never wins." The mountain stood like a wall between worlds, white, vast, and merciless. It was September 1799. In the valleys below, the remnants of the Italian campaign gathered, 20,000 Russians and Austrians, weary from months of fighting, led by a 70-year-old man whose name Europe had learned to fear, Alexander Suvorov. His orders were madness to cross the Alps, break through the French lines in Switzerland, and link up with allies already shattered by defeat. The generals whispered that it couldn't be done. Suvorov only said, "We are Russians. We were not born to retreat from stone." At dawn on September 24th, the army reached the St. Gotthard Pass, a thin scar winding through mountains of ice and fog. The air was thin, the sky bruised with cloud. The French, under General Lecourbe, waited above, their cannons guarding every bend. Suvorov dismounted and stood on the frozen ground. He could feel the mountain silence pressing on his chest. "Mountains do not block us," he said softly. "They only test us." The first columns began to climb. Boots slipped, muskets clattered. The wind tore at their cloaks like claws. Grenadiers crawled on hands and knees, clinging to ropes and rock. The higher they went, the more the air turned to ice. Then thunder. Cannon fire echoed down the cliffs. Smoke rolled through the ravine, white turned black. Men fell without a sound. Yet the columns climbed on, driven not by command but by will. Suvorov rode close behind them, his horse's hooves skidding on the frost. When a shell burst near him, his aide tried to pull him back. The old general only smiled, eyes bright as steel. "The enemy fires from above," he said. "Good. Saves us the trouble of aiming high." By midday, the vanguard reached the narrow bridge at Rios Gorge. The locals called it Devil's Bridge. A torrent roared beneath it, a river so wild it threw mist into the sky. The French waited across the span, muskets flashing. As Suvorov's grenadiers charged, the French blew the bridge apart. The planks vanished into the abyss with a scream of splintered wood and falling men. For a moment, silence, only the sound of the river. Then Suvorov's voice cut through the chaos. "Across! Build your bridge from the bodies of heroes if you must, but across!" They did. Under fire and freezing rain, men lashed together beams, ropes, and even their fallen comrades' packs. Others climbed along the cliff walls, finding paths where no path existed. One by one, they crossed. By dusk, the Russians had seized the far bank. The French withdrew. The Devil's Bridge, now broken, burning, conquered, lay behind them. Suvorov stood watching the smoke rise into the snow-filled sky. He whispered, "God was with us, or perhaps he simply pitied us." The march continued, through Andermatt, Altdorf, and the wild valleys of Schwyz. The men were half-starved, soaked, their uniforms in rags. Still, Suvorov marched on foot beside them, refusing a horse. He shared their bread, their silence, their disbelief that they were still alive. Each night he walked the camp, bending over the wounded, covering them with his own cloak. When an officer protested that a field marshal should not sleep among privates, Suvorov only said, "A general without soldiers is a beggar. I stay with my treasure." But the enemy was not done. At Muota Valley on September 30, the French under General Molitor fell upon the Russian rearguard. Snow turned to mud beneath the pounding feet. The battle raged for hours, bayonets clashing, musket smoke mixing with fog. Suvorov commanded from a ridge, his voice carrying through the storm. "Hold the line! Keep your fire tight!" Then, seeing the enemy stretch their flank, he made his move. With the small detachment, he struck sideways through the forest, appearing where the French least expected. The mountain swallowed his men, and then spat them out behind the French lines. Confusion spread like wildfire. By evening, the French were in retreat, leaving the valley strewn with muskets and silence. The Russians cheered, but Suvorov did not. He knew victory meant nothing if his army froze in these cursed peaks. His allies had been destroyed at Zurich. No rescue would come. They were alone in the white wilderness. On October 1st, he gathered his officers beneath a sky bruised with snow. "There is no road ahead," one of them said. Suvorov looked at the map, then at the mountains. "Then we make one." The next morning, the army began the final ordeal, crossing the Panics Pass, 2,400 meters high, buried under blizzards and ice. No one who was there ever forgot it. Men tied themselves together with ropes to keep from falling. Horses slipped and screamed before vanishing into the fog below. Cannons were left behind. Packs were thrown aside. The wind howled so fiercely that voices vanished before they could reach another ear. Suvorov, now walking with a stick, went first. He carried a torch wrapped in cloth, its flame guttering in the wind. "Follow the light!" he shouted. "Follow Russia!" For 3 days they climbed through the storm. The snow reached their waists. Food was gone. Some men froze standing, their rifles still in hand. When they stopped for the night, they dug pits in the snow and huddled together for warmth. The old general moved among them, lifting a canteen here, adjusting a blanket there, a ghost in white armor. When they finally reached the ridge, the sun broke through for the first time in days. Below lay the Rhine Valley, vast and green and merciful. Some men wept, others simply stared. They descended in silence. Suvorov did not ride. He walked with the last of his soldiers, helping a wounded drummer boy across the ice. Out of 20,000, fewer than half were fit to march. Yet no flag was lost, no cannon abandoned without cause, no honor tarnished. When they reached safety, messengers brought word. The campaign was over. The Tsar would recall him. The war in Switzerland was lost. Suvorov said nothing. He sat by the campfire that night, snow melting on his cloak, and watched the smoke curl toward the dark alpine sky. Around him the men slept, their faces hollow but peaceful. He murmured to himself, "We have crossed not mountains but the measure of what men can endure." And in that silence, colder than the ice, higher than the stars, a legend was born. Winter of 1799. Snow fell heavy on the roads from Austria to Moscow as Suvorov returned home, not with trophies nor banners, but with the hollow eyes of a man who had walked the edge between life and death. Europe called him the conqueror of the Alps, the general who had defied nature itself. Yet in Russia, silence greeted his name. Emperor Paul V, disillusioned with the collapse of the Austro-Russian alliance, withdrew his favor. Audiences were cancelled, honors rescinded, and Suvorov, once the pride of the empire, became a forgotten figure in his own homeland. He did not complain. He retired to his small estate at Konchanskoye, where birch trees whispered like old soldiers and the wind carried the echo of past battles. Each morning he still rose before dawn, trained with the peasants, swung his sword with a rhythm both graceful and weary, as if his body still remembered the cadence of command. Villagers sometimes saw torchlight in his courtyard at night, the old general standing alone in the snow, rehearsing orders to invisible troops. Letters reached him from every corner of Europe, from Austria, Switzerland, Italy, men who had fought beside him, young officers seeking to learn his art. He began writing his Science of Victory, short and spare, no rhetoric, only the truths of battle. Speed is the soul of victory. Discipline is strength. Love is the chain of loyalty. It was not just a manual. It was his heart distilled into words. But his body began to fail. The mountains he had conquered had left their mark on his bones. In the spring of 1800, illness struck. The Tsar sent word of pardon and restoration, too late. On May 18, 1800, in St. Petersburg, the undefeated general of Russia drew his final breath. No trumpets, no parade, only a few guards standing in silent grief. Beside his bed lay a small notebook. On its last page, in a trembling hand, were 3 words: serve, believe, endure. His funeral was simple, but the people lined the streets. As the coffin passed, they threw flowers upon the snow. An old soldier murmured, "He did not just teach us how to fight, he taught us how to live." Time passed. Empires rose and fell, yet the name Suvorov endured. Cadets in Russia's military academies still studied his maxims, repeating them before battle drills. Train hard, fight easy, move fast, strike sharp, and live with honor. His strategies became doctrine. His humanity became legend. Even Napoleon once said, "If I had Suvorov in my army, I would have conquered all Europe." The Russians needed no comparison. To them, he was not just a general, he was the spirit of their nation. 2 centuries later, his statues still stand, in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and in the Swiss Alps he once crossed. Travelers pause before his statue, sometimes in snow, sometimes in sunlight, and feel not sentiment, but awe. What stands carved in stone is not a saint, but a strategist, a man who turned war into art, discipline into power, and speed into genius. Alexander Vassilievich Suvorov, the general who never knew defeat, endures as one of the brightest symbols of Russian and world military mastery. His name does not merely echo with victory, it reminds the world that genius in war lies not in cruelty, but in the vision to find order within chaos and to turn it into triumph. And that was the full story. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Stories and Documents, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any future episodes like this one. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.